Hello, everyone. We're going to start in about a minute. We're waiting for a few more people to join. So bear with us for a little bit, please. Okay, so I think we're going to start now. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today for our first webinar at Southern Voice. We're very excited about that. My name is Gabriela Keseberg-Davalos. I'm head of communications at Southern Voice. And I just wanted to give you a brief intro about what Southern Voice is and specifically what our initiative, the State of the Sustainable Development Goals, is about. Southern Voice is a network of 51 think tanks from the Global South. We have research centers in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, covering around 26 nationalities. And all these research centers are looking at sustainable development and its various fields. Our flagship initiative, the State of the Sustainable Development Goals, is working with 12 of those teams and looking at 6 country case studies, 2 in Asia, 2 in Latin America, and 2 in Africa. The countries are Bolivia, Peru, Ghana, Nigeria, Sri Lanka, and India. 3 of the teams are looking at the regions as a whole. So they're looking at the African continent, Latin America, and Asia, and they're looking at how the Sustainable Development Goals set by the UN a few years ago are actually working. Those reports are going to come out very soon, in a few weeks, so stay tuned about that. And then we have 3 teams that are looking at thematic areas. One of them is how the goals work among each other, if they actually help each other or are having negative effects between them. Those are called synergies and trade-offs. And the team is looking at how those synergies, so the positive effects, can be maximized and the trade-offs can be minimized. Another team is looking at how, for example, global issues like arms trafficking, drug trafficking, climate change, the 4th industrial revolution, etc., have an effect on those sustainable development goals and on local policies and local policies, for example. And the third one is the idea of leaving no one behind in society. And today we're going to be talking about that as well. So we are very lucky that 2 of the teams have joined forces today. It's a team from Peru and from Bolivia, and they're going to be talking about the research that they did in their specific countries on the synergies between education and employment. And they're also going to tell us how what they found could be translated to other areas of the world and what we can learn from that. So now I'm going to transfer to who will be your facilitator today. And that's my colleague, Paula Pino. She's the communications coordinator at GRADE. And she will be telling you a little bit how the webinar will go. And yeah, without further ado, I transfer now to Paula, and I wish everybody a great webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriela. Hello, everyone. As Gabriela said, my name is Paula Pino. I am the communications coordinator at the Group for the Analysis of Development based in Peru. Today, I will be sharing this Global Goals Week webinar. First, I would like to introduce our speakers. Lorena Alcázar is a senior researcher at GRADE in Peru, and Werner Hernani Limarino is a senior researcher at Fundación ARU in Bolivia. I will explain briefly the structure of this webinar. For the first 40 minutes, Lorena and Werner are going to answer 4 series of questions which the team have prepared for them. and then they will have the opportunity to answer your questions for 15 minutes. You can send your question whenever you want during the initial discussion using the feed of your GoToWebinar panel. After this initial discussion, I will share a wrap-up of your question with the presenters. I have to say also that you are joining today's webinar in listen-only mode. If you're having any technical issues, please notify the team in the question feed. Okay, so let's start with Lorena. Could you give us a brief overview of your state of the SDG research? Please, Lorena.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to share the results of this study through this webinar in the Global Weeks. I'm going to start introducing the study that we work on as part of this SBSS project. We look at the case of Peru, particularly we work on the SDG 4, education of access to education of quality, and the SDG 8 regarding access to decent jobs. And we focus on the youth in Peru. What we wanted to do is show why is the Peruvian case important and what lessons can we learn from this case. Peru is a country that seems to be doing well in terms of SDG in general and also in terms of SDG 4 and 8. However, we have very high inequalities within the country. So this principle of leave no one behind is key here. So what we wanted to do is to show who are the left behind, how traditionally marginalized groups such as indigenous people and women are present in these left behind groups, and also look at the synergies between the two SDGs, how access to education of quality is related to access to decent job, but not only in general, but in particular for these marginalized groups and for these left behind people. How, if someone is left behind in terms of access to a quality of education, that person is also is going to have a higher probability or not, or of being left behind in terms of access to a decent job. So for that, what we did was work with quantitative data using the secondary data that fortunately is available in Peru to identify the profiles of the people that are left behind, and then estimate the synergies and trade-off between these two SDGs. And we also use qualitative data. We did in-depth interviews with more than 40 persons, youth in Peru, to try to see the life stories behind the quantitative results. And that's what hopefully I'm going to try to show you today. Thank you.
Thanks, Lorena. Now I ask Werner to share with us an overview of his study. Please, Werner.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you to everyone who's taking the time to listen to us. The Bolivian study is not just one study, it's a collection of studies with different perspectives about this question of who is being left behind in terms of education and also in terms of employment. We don't have like a unique, coherent story. We have a different set of perspectives, which is, from my point of view, the richness of the study. And the different perspectives are different way of answering the question of who is being left behind. As I'm gonna explain to you later, you can answer this question in different ways, and the interesting point is that the way in which you ask and answer the question has very important policy implications. So yeah, I'm looking forward to explain to you what we did and share some results with you.
Great, Werner, thank you. And our second set of questions is, what does being left behind in education and being left behind in employment mean? And who are the left behind in the cases of Peru and Bolivia? Let's continue with Lorena.
Sorry, I was mute. Sorry. Okay, what we did was constructing the profiles of the left behind in terms of education and decent jobs. Using, as I was mentioning, using quantitative data, we try to show the profile of this particular group. I am going to show you, I don't have much time, but I'm going to show you some of the examples of what we did to try to understand more clearly who are the left behind here. You can see there an example of a profile of someone of the left behind in terms of education. In this case, particularly in terms of access to education in reading. And the left behind are characterized in this case by children, indigenous, underweight, from families at the lowest socioeconomic level, with parents who did not complete primary education and that attend rural public schools in the Andean highlands of Peru. If you have someone, a child with these characteristics, these children are going to be 83% more likely to be left behind than their counterparts. And if we look at the case of mathematics, it's going to be very similar. But in this case, we also have as a characteristic that we have girls with higher probability of being left behind. Then we have that a girl who is from the poorest groups in Peru, who attend rural public schools, who has parents that did not complete primary education. That girl is going to be 84% more likely than their counterparts to be left behind in terms of access to quality of education, in this case of math. Then we also look at the cases of who is left behind in terms of access to decent jobs. Here, let me stop a little bit to explain how do we understand who is left behind in terms of access to decent jobs. Since in Peru, more than 90% of the young people do not work in a decent job, do not have access to a decent job. Actually, 4 out of 5 work in the informal sector. If we want to look at who is really left behind, we cannot just look at who works in the informal sector. So what we did here, we constructed a specific measure of vulnerability of precarious jobs. People that are in very poor working conditions, but they cannot not work, so they have to work in whatever they can in a surviving job. So these are jobs that where they earn less than the minimum wage, where they have unstable jobs, where they have no working rights, etc. Very precarious. And we also have the young that are the so-called NEET, not in employment, education, or training. These are, so we look at these two indicators of being left behind in terms of access to a decent job. In the first case, if we look at the young Peruvians that are not in employment, education, or training, we also constructed the profile, and we can see here that these people are mostly women living with children under 5 years old, mostly married or cohabitating, that not finish primary education, and that live in extreme poverty in urban areas and have a disability. If we find someone that has these characteristics, this person these women will have a higher probability, a 91% higher probability of being left behind. So it's almost for sure a person that is going to be left behind and it's going to be a need. We did a similar work, but this time looking at what we call working precariously, these people that have these surviving jobs. And again, what we are going to have there is a woman living with children under 5 years old, married or cohabitating, that did not finish primary education. But in this case, these women are from the rural areas and are indigenous. The not working and not studying is a problem basically of urban people, and working precariously is in most of the country, but is more clear a problem for the indigenous people living in rural areas. So these women, indigenous and living in rural areas in extreme poverty with children under 5, etc., is going to be 91. Is going to have a 91 higher probability of being left behind than the reference group. So what we see here is that clearly indigenous and women are marginalized groups that combine and with some other variables such as poverty and or rural or living in rural areas are going to have much higher probabilities of being left behind in education and also later on in terms of access to decent jobs.
Many thanks, Lorena. Now let's go over Werner.
Hello. Okay. Yeah. Well, the first thing I would like to do is to try to. There are 3 ways to answer the question of who is left behind. You can try to answer the question counting the number of people and identifying them who are according to some if you talk about education, for example, you can define a threshold and say, okay, everyone who's learning behind this threshold is being left behind, and you can identify and count the number of people who are behind the threshold and say, okay, this is the percentage of people who are being left behind. That's one way of doing this thing. A second way to do this thing is like try to identify not people but groups of people and say, okay, the left behind are women, the left behind are indigenous people, that those who are okay are non-indigenous people, those who are okay are men, for example. The difference between one and the other is what are the policy implications. In one in the first question, what you imply is that the system is correct. In the case of the educational system, you said, okay, the educational system is working correctly, but there's a bunch of people who are not doing okay. So we have to fix the educational system for these people, the rest is okay. In the second question, when you try to identify groups of people who are left behind, then you're saying, okay, the educational system has much more problems because the educational system is leaving behind women, the educational system is leaving behind indigenous people, the educational system is not enough to compensate poor people. So there's a difference of these 2 approaches, and I think the Bolivian example identifies what are the answers with one set of questions and what is the answers with another set of questions. And we have disagreements among the team of which is the right question and which is the right answer. From my point of view, when you have a system which is leaving behind in terms of learning in math or learning in reading and writing skills, more than 90% of the population, as is the case in the Dominican Republic, as is the case in Haiti, as is the case in Ecuador, as is the case in Panama, And many other countries then do not participate in learning assessments, such as Bolivia. Bolivia has participated in a learning assessment in 2017, but the data is not public. So I'm gonna assume that the data is so bad that they don't want to make it public. So if you have that case, then trying to identify groups or trying to identify people is not really interesting. And it's not really key, because the key is you have a system that is not working, that is leaving behind almost all population, even rich people who are paying a lot of money to be in a school, is not learning enough math, and it's not learning enough reading and writing skills. Then you have a system that is wrong, and you have a system that is not working. And the solution is not to try to fix the systems or to try to incorporate people to the system. The solution is try to rethink a system and try to make everyone in the system, teacher, administrators, and students and parents, different set of incentives to make the system work. When you have a system that is not producing skills, an educational system that is not producing skills, then why should you have a labor market that is rewarding years of education? As the case of Bolivia makes it clear, in Bolivia you have almost no difference between a person who has 17 years of school and a person who has 8 years of school. I said almost no difference in terms of wages. The distribution of wages is equally between these two groups. And when you have, what this implies is that there are no returns to more schooling. Then defining who's left behind in terms of employment is also a hard question, because it is not enough to say that a person who's earning a lot of money is not being left behind. You have to consider, why is he earning that tons of money? Again, it is not enough to say a person that is having a stable job in the public administration is not being left behind. You have to consider, why is he having that type of employment? Does he deserve it? Is he contributed to the society with that type of job? So I invite you to download and read both studies, because again, you will have different perspectives on different type of approaches that gives different answers, and that has different policy implications.
Great, Werner. Thank you. Now let's focus on the synergies and trade-offs. Does being left behind in education automatically translated in being left behind in employment? And what are the experiences of Peru and Bolivia? Please, Lorena, what does your study show?
Okay. Before going to the synergies, let me address a little bit what Werner was saying. It's interesting, in effect, how the different studies look at these left behind issues in terms of education and work. In the case of Peru, in fact, it's not that the educational system works well. We have, for example, 46% of children nationally reaching satisfactory levels in terms of reading. But in comparison to that 46%, we have only 16 that reach these satisfactory reading levels if we look at the rural children. So the differences are huge. And what we are trying to do is to see how the relation between education and employment is for these these different groups, for the general group, for most of the children in Peru, and also for the groups that are even within the worst group, the ones that do not reach satisfactory levels at all. And in terms also of work, is kind of the same figure, maybe not like in the case of Bolivia, but we do have a poor job market. As I was mentioning, 4 out of 5 young Peruvians work in the informal sector, basically without working rights and not in decent jobs. But again, we are focusing on the very left behind, and see what happens with this group. Again, maybe not as bad as Bolivia in terms of not being left behind in education globally. In the case of Peru, we have almost 50% reaching satisfactory levels, but it's not far from perfect. But let's see what happens with the group that is in worst conditions. And in this case, we also want to show that it's not only access to education what matters, but also access to education of quality. So because in Peru we have very high coverage rates for education, both in primary and even in secondary education, but not necessarily access to education of quality. Unfortunately, we have data in this case to look at how the children are doing in terms of math and reading and other areas of education, and so we can look both at the effect on jobs, on access to jobs, of access to education in general, and to access of education of quality. So if you look at the table that we have on screen now, you can see the relationship between being left behind in education with the probability of being a NEET. A NEET is not in employment or in education, or also related to the probability of this very precarious job that I was mentioning before. So, for example, if you are left behind in terms of reading at the age of 15, that will increase your probability of working in a very precarious employment at 22 years old by 14%, a very significant and high increase in the probability. You can see that the being left behind in education is not very significant, a very significant determinant of being left behind in terms of being a NEET, but it is in terms of working precariously, particularly, of course, when 15 years of age, more than 12 years of age. But what is also interesting, and this is controlling for many other variables, for indigeneity, region, socioeconomic level, etc. But look also on something that we found interesting. The last row did not complete basic schooling. If someone does not complete basic schooling, it of course increases the probability of being left behind in terms of access to jobs. But these probabilities are lower than if you are left behind in terms of access to quality of education by this process of how do you do in math and reading. So we show here an answer to one of our main questions. It matters more access to education of quality than access to just schooling, years of schooling. We also looked particularly at what happens with the groups that were our concern from the beginning. Being a woman or being an indigenous, and the traditionally marginalized groups in Peru, and how these groups do in terms of being left behind in reading or in access to jobs. And what we found here, let me try to move the slide, but for some reason it's not working. Doesn't work. Okay, yeah, there it is. In this table, we show how being a part of a disadvantaged group, women versus men, or lowest poverty level versus the highest, indigenous to non-indigenous, etc., what are the probabilities of being left behind? And it's in many interesting things we can see here. For example, being a woman does not increase the probability of being left behind in terms of access to quality of education, but it does in terms of being left behind in the job market. The probabilities are much higher of working precariously, even though women were not left behind in education. Poverty and being indigenous and rural are even more important, and in both in terms of access to education and in terms of access to decent jobs. And some other important findings that we wanna show that we think are more interesting is that years of education, as I was mentioning, comparing this access to years of education to quality of education. Years of education have a negative and significant effect of 3.2% of the probability of working precariously, but when you include education performance in the analysis, the years of education are not significant anymore, showing again that what really matters is the access to quality education. And also it's interesting that it's more important in terms of your situation in the job market. It's more important, it's more risky, you are more vulnerable for belonging to a marginalized group, women, indigenous, than because you didn't access quality of education. So marginalized groups, particularly indigenous women, are more likely to have precarious jobs independently of how they do or in terms of access to quality of education. And also, there are some interesting results for the case of gender that we want to mention. As I was mentioning, no significant gender, we don't see a significant gender gaps in terms of education, of access to quality of education in primary and secondary levels. But even if that's the case, women tend to do poorly in the job market. Girls are disproportionately expected to fulfill other roles in the society and end up with precarious jobs that allow them to do that. And that's what we also got from the stories that we incorporated in the qualitative work. Being a woman increases the likelihood of being a need by 11% and working precariously by 12%, and this seems to be related more than with what happens in the education world, with what happens with traditional roles and work discrimination and cultural norms. While failing to complete basic education increases the likelihood that a man work precariously by 4%, by only 4%, being a woman increases the likelihood of working precariously by 21%. So in spite of the results in terms of education, women are much more penalized or discriminated in the labor market. And there is clearly a synergy between what happens in education and what happens in the job market, but there are a lot more going on that it doesn't have necessarily to do with that synergy or that, but more with other cultural and norms or practices in the country.
Okay, thank you, Lorena. What about your findings, Werner, between the synergies and trade-offs between these two SDGs? Okay, so until Werner return his connection to audio, let's go to the fourth question. Okay, so what can countries can do to keep on track to achieve these both SDGs? What lessons can we draw from the experiences of both countries? Let's start with the final answer with Lorena.
Okay, well, Sorry. Well, okay. Probably the main finding and lesson that we want to emphasize is that we have to be careful when looking at the how are we doing, how countries are doing in terms of SDGs, because behind the average there are a lot going on in terms of how marginalized groups are doing, in terms of how the left behind are doing, and this have an effect also on how SDGs are related, how with synergies and trade-offs that are also so important. So in this case, we show that indeed there is an important synergy between education and work. So if we invest in education of quality, and we make sure that everybody get access to this education of quality, we are gonna see better results also in terms of access to decent jobs. But we also show that the story is more complex, that marginalized groups seem to face more other barriers besides access to education of quality that we have to look at. Belonging to a marginalized group is even more important than being left behind in access to education. Of course, this doesn't mean that we don't have to worry about giving access to education of quality for everybody, but we have to look at other things too. And in terms of particular recommendations that we want to mention that come from the case from the Peruvian case, but I applied mostly to other countries with facing similar problems, is in terms of education in particular, since we are seeing that the differences are enormous and there are particular groups, the poor in the Andean regions, in the rural areas of Peru, where the parents do not complete education, where conditions are not good. We have to emphasize that governments have to invest in education, focusing or investing more in education in the difficult remote areas, where not always expenditure in education is the same as in urban areas. Governments in Peru and in other parts of the world tend to invest and to apply programs where it's easier, where it's cheaper, and where you can get more easily impacts and leaving behind the groups that are in remote, difficult areas. So, and since we are focusing in these groups and showing once again that indigenous people in poorer areas of Peru are doing really bad, we insisted that governments have to be careful, and that's why it's so important to look at the left behind. This means provide infrastructure, school hours, higher budgets, access to technology. That's also really important since we are dealing with this digital revolution, and if we don't look at that, this is part of the study too, but we didn't include it in this presentation, but it's part of the full study, how this digital, the use of ICTs, of information and communications technology, may affect Peru as other poor countries, and how it may affect the poorest, who are going to also to face inequalities and are going to be left behind in terms of access to technology, and that the digital divide is going to be worse. So we have to look at that too, make sure that everybody have access to digital education, to technology and education. And of course, as I was mentioning, we have all these gender issues, so we also need to work with gender specific programming in Peruvian schools. Programs, interventions should not be gender blind, but should take into consideration these findings. And in terms of the SDG 8, most of the problems are related to informality, which is a big problem for Peru and for most lowest and middle income countries. Particularly for the poor, particularly for women, but informality is part of what we have to address if we want to get to SDG 8, and we have to we also see here and in other studies that the problems are multidimensional, complex. So traditional vocational programs, traditional employment programs are not tackling the vulnerability that comes from a multidimensional, from long-lasting deprivations that particularly traditionalized, marginalized groups like indigenous women, for example, face from early childhood and through their lives. So, and they are kind of condemned to work in precarious jobs if we don't look at this complexity from early childhood. And in terms here too, it's important to look at the implications of the digital revolution and make sure that although we are all aware of the benefits of this digital revolution, we have to make sure that this is not going to contribute to these inequalities and making the situation of the left behind even worse.
Okay, thank you, Lorena. Before welcoming back Werner, please, to our audience, don't forget to send your questions through the question feed on your GoToWebinar panel. Okay, Werner, welcome back. Let's return to the question regarding the synergies and trade-offs between these two SDGs. What do your findings show? And then you can share some recommendations from the experience of Bolivia.
Thank you, Paula. Yeah, well, I would like to answer your question, and using Naomi King's question, she asked us, how does a country with synergies among education and employment look like? And my answer to both questions would be, it would look like South Korea. South Korea on 2005 had an average year of schooling of around 10.25 years of schooling. And in 10 years, it has increased the level of schooling to 11.5 years of schooling. And that's an increase of almost 1 year of the school in 10 years. If you correlate this to the GDP per worker, that is a measure of productivity, Korea has increased the level of GDP from around $45,000 to near $65,000. When you do the math and you calculate what is the increase in GDP per worker, our measure of productivity, that is associated with an increase in schooling, you get a number that is 14,000. That is 1 year of one additional year of schooling in the Korean population that works has translated in $14,000 more. That is a country with synergies between the educational system and the labor market and the production process. What is a country that is not having any synergies in terms of education and labor market and productivity? Well, that would look like Nicaragua and Venezuela. Venezuela, for example. Venezuela, the last 10 years has increased the level of education in almost 2 years, from a level of around 6.8 to more than 8.8. That's a lot. That's a lot of schooling gains. But the GDP per worker, and I'm not talking about Venezuela right now. I'm making the comparison between 2005 and 2015. That 2 years more of schooling has only represented $70 of increase in GDP per worker in Venezuela. So if you want to talk about Bolivia and Peru, in Bolivia, 1 additional year of education, one additional year of schooling, only increases GDP per worker in $1,000. In Peru, I think it's $3,000. So what we want to do is we want to link educational systems that produce a lot of skills and learning, like the Korean one, and use those skills and those things that people learn in school in the production process. That would be a system designed to link both education and employment. In our case, in Bolivia, that is not happening. And that is not happening because of many factors. One of them is that people that are going to school are not learning anything. The proof of this is the attempts by the municipality of La Paz of measuring education and learning, and the hiding of the databases of educational learning assessments of the 2017-2018 tests. Another reason is that the labor market values much more connections. In the last 5 years, political connections. There is a paper which I believe is not available in our study for Southern Boys, but it can be available, but it's available on the web right now, in which we show that 1G, this political connections measure, has increased from 0% to almost 6% in the last 10 years. That means that education is not valuable. You cannot get a job if you have good education, but if you have political connections, you can have a return of around 6% per additional point of political connections. So again, I believe that we don't have to think, well, depending on the country in which you live, sometimes you have to think, okay, can I do better within the system? Can I improve the incomes? Can I improve the money within the system? In other contexts, the right question is, how do I change the system? How do I change the rules? How do I change the institutions that are assigning children to school, that are assigning some children to public schools, some children to private schools? What are the rules that are assigning teachers to different types of school? What are the rules that are assigning teachers to rural schools and to urban schools? I believe it's in the case of Bolivia, as is in the case of many other Latin American countries, such as Bolivia, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, for example, a country in which I am right now. The question is not much about which is the magical input that is going to solve or is going to increase everything. The question is, how do we redesign the rules to make the system work? Because right now it's not working.
Great, thank you, Werner. And now I will share the question from the audience. Okay, but before, Werner, could you share with us some recommendations from the experience in Bolivia? What lessons can we draw from your study?
Yeah, the major recommendation is context matter, I would say. And when I mean context, it encompasses a lot of things, especially the type of institutions. Sometimes institutions are very difficult to measure, especially for us economists that are used to, I don't know, quantitative data. But institutions determine a lot of the outcomes that we see. And when the outcomes are as bad as the one we observe for learning in Latin America, in which only Chile and Costa Rica has kind of good outcomes, and as bad as many African countries, so I would say almost all of African countries, then the problem is not only money, it's not only the inputs that are available, it's not going to be solved by random evaluations that identify some magic input. The problem is about how the systems are organized and how do we organize them better. How can we learn from institutional assessments, from institutional studies, how the system is working, why it's working that way, what incentives that actors have, and how to redesign these incentives to make the system work for most people and leave no one behind. And that would be my recommendation.
Thank you, Werner. And now I will share your questions, the question from the audience, with our speakers. We have picked 5 questions, very interesting questions. The first one is, how has the 2030 agenda helped Peru, Bolivia, and or other Latin America countries work towards achieving synergies between SDGs? Another question is, does gender impact the extent to which synergies between education and employment are realized? Our second question is, does gender impact the extent to which synergies between education and employment are realized? And a third question is, what do you think will be the role of civil society to improve quality of education? And which is the role of private sector as well? Yeah, and I have another question that I would like to share is, the audience would like to know about the presenter's perspective on the role of affirmative action for inclusion. I think we'll go with that 4 questions. Okay, let's start with Lorena.
Can you repeat the first question too, please, Paula?
Yeah, that is about how has the 2030 agenda helped Peru, Bolivia, and other Latin America countries work towards achieving SDGs? That is more a general question. Okay, so whenever you want.
Okay, thank you for the questions too. Let's see what we can say about this. Regarding the agenda of the SDGs, I think that's clearly depends on each particularly context of every country. Of course, it helps to have this international agenda, these compromises. That clearly helps, but it's very difficult to find the real commitment in the countries, particularly when different complicated political or economic situations are affecting a particular country, like Werner was saying, like taking the extreme case of Venezuela, for example, or Bolivia. And in Peru, we do have a SDGs agenda everywhere. You go to a ministry and you see the walls with all the figures of SDGs, but it's more in the walls with these pictures of SDGs that in real policy. For this study we look at the mentioning of SDGs in particularly in the ministries that we are looking at, and in real things, like we can really see what they are doing in the Ministry of Social Inclusion or Education. and when we go to the details, it's not that clear that is influencing or meaning something. In Peru, because we have a particular political context. In Bolivia, the situation is even more complicated, etc. So it's important to try to establish this monitoring and these commitments. In this case, since we are looking at the left behind, this left behind, that's what we particularly look to. This left behind, has it meant something can we see what has it implied in terms of policy? And we don't see much. So we are fulfilling SDG, we are improving this general indicator, but it's important to go to the details in the monitoring of the SDGs. In terms of the second questions about gender, of course, that's key. As I was mentioning, is one of the main things we think it came out from the study as very interesting, as very important, how the synergy of education behind education, what it means for women in Peru, particularly for indigenous women who are the very excluded group in terms of access to jobs. And we found that the problem of women is not that much in terms of access to education. They go to schools, and in many other countries of the world, when girls have the opportunity to go to schools, they excel. So we see that in terms of performance, in terms of what they do in math and in reading, we don't find much gender gaps, but we still see them in the job market. Women are doing much worse in terms of access to decent jobs. They tend to be in working precariously, or they tend to be in the need category, which is a whole different issue, because there are other roles that play, women roles that play, that have something to do with, I don't want to get in this discussion of what is behind being a need, but staying with working precariously, we know that there are gender issues behind that, and that women are disproportionately punished or discriminated for less years of education, or for not doing, or for differences in education more than men, maybe because they as some other studies indicate, it's because they have to fulfill other roles in the house, or because they face discrimination at work. So we have to look at the whole picture to understand the synergy between education and work for women, and the same for other groups. And this takes me to the question of affirmative action, which is, I find very interesting in this context. And I think from my perspective, there's something that we can do with that, but we have to be careful to don't expect much from that. Taking the case of women, and it's different in the case of each excluded group. In the case of women, since they are doing and pushing the results a little bit, assuming that they do as well as men in education, and still they face more discrimination and at work, then we can help with some affirmative action. But if we look at the in indigenous problem, if we only deal with affirmative action, we are not solving the problem, because they are currently not having access to the same opportunities in terms of education. They are going to schools that do not have the same infrastructure, that do not have the same type of teachers, that they don't have the same resources, and they are not doing as well in terms of access to quality of education. So we have to deal with that, and we have to make sure that they have the same opportunities in education, to see what happens in the job market. And if they still face discrimination for being indigenous, which is also clearly a problem, then we can also look at other types of policies. And I do think that some kind of affirmative action policies may play a role. I think I'm answering all questions.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you, Lorena. Okay, Werner, what are your thoughts on these questions?
Okay. Yeah, on the SDG question, I think there's no evidence right now to say that, to say if the SDG agenda is working or not. In Bolivia, the signs would show that it is not working. That, as Lorena was saying, is more barking than bite. But the real question for me is, why should we expect that it would work? As far as I read, my reading of the MDG agenda, of the 2015 agenda, is that it has not worked on most development outcomes. And again, my reading of what is happening with the SDG agenda relative to the MDG agenda is that it's almost business as usual. So if, again, things are not working, things are working the same way as it worked before, why should we expect a change? Especially in those contexts, as Lorena was saying, are challenging because there are many other factors that are not contributed to this to work. So yeah, I cannot answer the question as is it working? I don't know, but do I expect it will work? No, I don't expect it will work, at least for my country and the countries I work with. Then moving to the women and indigenous question. Yes, I believe that there are some groups of people, especially women and especially indigenous women, who have a lot more disadvantages. But again, I think that you should look at the particular issues of groups when you have at least a group of people that is getting what they are supposed to get. If, again, 90% of the population is below the minimum level of learning in a country, then, at least from my point of view, to focus on indigenous or to focus on women, sorry for that noise, it's somebody working, my neighbor is working something. If you focus only on women and you focus on indigenous results, then you're losing the big picture. And the big picture is the system is not working, even for the men, even for the non-indigenous men, even for the non-indigenous men who are in the 10 richest decile. So if the system is not getting learning results for those who have advantages, then imagine what's happening to those who have disadvantages. And yeah, it's not doing a policy trying to fix the results of this population, is trying to rethink a way to design a market, a set of rules and an education system that produce results for most of the population. On the role of the private sector, that's a very hard question. I think the private sector has to play a role. What type of role is it playing on, and what is the role it should play? I think it's an unanswered question in the case of Bolivia, and I think it's an unanswered question in many much more advanced countries than Bolivia, such as Chile, for example. many societies are asking what is the role the private sector should play, and what we have to do is learn of this type of experiments that many countries are doing, and see whether they fit our problems or not. What was the other one? I think I covered 4. I'm missing 1.
The fourth question was on the affirmative action for inclusion.
We don't have experiences in with affirmative action policies in challenging contexts such as my country. So we have to learn a lot about what other countries are doing, and yeah, it's like I don't have an informed opinion on that, so I would like to skip it.
Okay, great. Many thanks to Lorena and Werner, and to our audience, of course. Both studies show key evidence on the synergies and trade-offs between education and employment, which is vital in social policy. And now I go over Gabriela, who has some important closing announcements.
Hi. Yeah, thank you, everybody. So I hope that this was a good webinar for you. Please feel free to send questions that might come up later. So we're going to share a slide now with some information of an email where you can send those questions to. And we already shared with you the studies and the URL of the microsite that we created just for these studies. But here they are again. So if you have any questions or comments, also feedback, that's totally welcome. Send it to info@southernvoice.org. And the URLs for the studies is stateofthesdgs.org or southernvoice.org. And also, of course, follow us on social media. If you haven't signed up for our newsletter, we invite you to do that. I want to say a big thank you to the 3 people who made this webinar possible, to Lorena, Werner, and Paula for taking the time to do this. And yeah, so that would be it for today. And thank you, everybody, for participating. Hope to see you again next time. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.